Thank you. It's good to see you, my friends. Ask your prayers for Cindy. She got ready to go tonight, but just before we were about to leave, and you could kind of look at her and tell she looked a little green around the gills tonight, and she asked your indulgence. We're hoping that this will be something that she'll feel better from real quick. Appreciate your prayers for the ministry that I have the privilege of being involved in, Quentin Road Baptist Church and Day Spring Bible College. We just have a lot of things right now. I probably mentioned when I was with you a year ago that we were moving towards getting a new college campus. And it's incredible what the Lord has done with that. It is one building, 5-minute drive from our church. Right now we have 13 buildings. This one building is so big, it has more than double the floor space of our 13 buildings. I mean, it's just have to be remodeled. And when this first began and we looked at this and they calculated the purchase of it and the proper remodeling of it, and they did a lot of work on it and said we were probably looking at a $12 million project, which seemed too much. But turns out Hobby Lobby has a program. They have a person employed full-time whose only job is to find large buildings that might go unused that could profitably be used by ministries. And he does a study to see whether the ministry could really use and all that. Long story short, Hobby Lobby bought that building for us. $4 million. And with the understanding that they have to own it for a year to get the proper tax write-offs on it and all that. But the building becomes ours March 15th. And so then we've been at work. We have a buyer for our present property for $4 million, which then leaves us to raise another $4 million. But our church, God has so blessed our church, and our folks are so giving and generous. We raised $1 million to build a college campus in the Philippines. At the same time, we started raising money for this project for our college here in the States. I mean, I've never seen anything like it in my life. Here's our $1 million project. Here's our $4 million project. We've raised the $1 million for the campus in the Philippines. Construction on it has started. We started a college there and meeting in a church now. And then so far, we've raised $2.3 million towards the campus here. But this is going to be quite a project. I talked with Pastor since I've been here in Florida. And the very first thing we need to do is re-roof the whole thing. And the roofing part of the project, building that big, is going to be about $1.1 million. And it'll be a dramatic thing, but when it's done, there'll be so much we can do with it. It's very exciting. Cindy and I will live in an apartment on the property when this is done. We currently live in a house on the present college property, but we'll live in an apartment in this property, and we're very excited about what we can do and what the Lord will make possible with all this. So I appreciate your prayers and all that. I will be leaving Tuesday. I leave Florida Saturday. I go to Powell, Tennessee. I'll be preaching at a church in Powell, Tennessee on Sunday, then driving home on Monday, and I leave Tuesday morning for a month in the Philippines, in which I will be teaching at our college in the Philippines that our church has started. There's another college that I have been teaching at in the Philippines for 30 years that I will be at there. We'll be having a big conference like the one we have at our church in the Philippines. Actually, we're having two of them, two different locations. Some of our church staff is coming to the Philippines to be part of that. We'll have one in Angeles City and one in Bataan, as well as I'll be preaching some other churches there. So that becomes a very, very exciting and challenging month. It'll be my 43rd trip to the Philippines teaching in Bible colleges. And it's an exciting thing, wonderful part of my life. Folks keep asking me, how long are you going to keep doing this? As long as I can sit in an airplane, I plan on continuing to go there. But it's exciting, but we appreciate your prayers. Tomorrow morning, our annual church trip to Israel is leaving to go to Israel Even though the threat of war is hanging over it, the theme of this trip was going to be standing with Israel, and we're going to have some messages that actually, I mentioned that we have the book coming out called Spiritual War Against Israel, 10 chapters written by me, 10 by Pastor Scudder, and some of the material from his chapters will be in presentations on that Israel trip. They left it up to the folks. They know the specter of war is hanging over it, but the response of people was, the purpose of this trip was not just tourists, but to stand with Israel. We want to go. So they're leaving in the morning. 77. And had a handful of people that backed out, but there's 77 people leaving. Actually, a few have already gone over, but it'll be 77 by the largest part of the group leaves tomorrow, and we covet your prayers for them. My pastor and his wife and 2 of our staff were in Israel in June during the 12-day war. They could not leave at the time they wanted to leave because all the airspace was closed. And so he actually sent back videos from the hotel they were staying in of the missiles being launched at Israel and being shot down. And they eventually were able to leave there and go to Egypt and come back to the United States out of Egypt. They had to drive to Egypt and then fly from Egypt back to the United States. So we appreciate your prayers so much for that group, and that we're in an interesting time. Well, Pastor was telling you about Australia. You understand governments all over the world have trouble with the concept of free speech. Boy, you're seeing it everywhere. In Syria, they have a new government in Syria that overthrew the Assad regime. I ironically was preaching to a Syrian church in Egypt, a church of Syrian refugees in Egypt when the Syrian government was overthrown. And we have service every night, and then I would go with several people to the apartment, and we're watching CNN, and they're watching the overthrow of the Syrian government. And the guy CNN was interviewing him. He was promising religious freedom. Because, it was as bad as it could get in Syria before that. But now we know his idea of religious freedom. So you can have Christian churches as long as you teach that Muhammad was a true prophet of God. You can go ahead and teach the rest of what you want. Which is no religious freedom at all. In England, they passed this law, and of course Australia is very tied to England, and this law back said that you're not allowed to say anything that offends people. Well, the law on its face is a manipulation of people. How do you know what's going to offend people? Who is it gets offended? I have friends that I can debate things with, and I don't get offended, and they don't get offended. I have Muslim friends that I can debate Christianity with, and they don't get offended, and I don't get offended. But, boy, there's some folks get offended at anything. And the heart behind this law in England, and I assume it's the heart behind this law in Australia, is to keep you from saying anything against homosexuality. That's where it's actually being enforced in England. If a homosexual will come forward and say that church said something that offended me, or that individual said something that offended me, then they can be prosecuted. Say, how can it get that bad? Well, let me tell you, it's been that bad. You all live in a free state of Florida. You don't know what it's like for some of us. I live in the People's Republic of Illinois. Bible colleges like ours, like the one I'm part of, are illegal in Illinois. We fought a battle to get the law changed. I fought a battle used to be illegal in Florida. And I led the fight to change that battle almost 20 years ago here in Florida, over 20 years ago here in Florida. And you have a wonderful piece of legislation. I'm biased. I literally wrote it. Had a CLA attorney looking over my shoulder, but I literally wrote the legislation that is the law here in Florida today. And it says if you have a Bible college and it has a religious name and a religious purpose, and it doesn't take government money, it's not under the jurisdiction of the state. We tried to get that same law in Illinois, and we actually passed the state Senate 4 times in Illinois. But in the House of Representatives, which is pretty much owned by the Board of Education, they would not allow it to be voted on. Now, they have not tried to enforce, because technically the law would say Bible colleges like ours are illegal. They have not tried to enforce that law. It would be an interesting legal defense in court that our legislation passed the Senate 4 times. But they, I will tell you, we're in this, we go through this every year. When we got it passed in the Senate, they'd have public hearing and in front of the state senators, and we'd be there and other folks, and the Board of Education would send somebody. And the very last time this went around, I'd said my piece, pastor had said his piece, and the Board of Education person got up and said, if we allow Bible colleges to operate unregulated in the state of Illinois, some of them might not admit homosexual students to prepare for the ministry. And they said, we can't have that. That was their argument. Now, you say, boy, that's Australia. I'm glad that's the other way around the world. Wait a minute. 2 weeks ago, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, folks came into a church service, took over the church service. You say, well, they're being prosecuted. But would you understand the defense that is being put on for these folks all over the country? Is that the defense is that a church is public domain, and anybody can go into a church and say anything they want, and that's the defense that is going to be presented in the federal court in Minneapolis in front of judges and possibly a jury from extremely liberal persuasion. Can you imagine if that became the law? That anyone could come into your church because it's an open forum and say anything they pleased. That is what they're arguing. And the Supreme Court actually dealt with this in 2012 and ruled against that idea. They said a church is a private assembly, and a church has the right to make its own determinations about what it does and what is said and what's involved in a church service. But they're just ignoring the Supreme Court decision in 2012 and saying because it's a church, it's an open forum, and anybody can speak. See, y'all don't get that stuff down here. There's a reason why people call it the free state of Florida. And I travel. I've preached in 49 states. I've preached in every state but Wyoming. I've preached 49 states. I travel all the time. And back during the pandemic, you know, folks were talking about how everybody in Florida was dying because of Governor DeSantis and because you didn't have all the regulations that were in other states and all. And they called him Governor Death, and people around the country believe that. And I was on an airplane talking to a couple that was sitting next to me, and I get to, somewhere in a conversation I mentioned I had 2 grandsons. They live in Florida, and they said, "Oh, we're so sorry. You know, we hope somehow they make it." But they had no idea. You don't know what you have here in the free state of Florida. Man, don't give it up. Amen. But we have these battles to fight on a national level here in the United States. So yeah, that's Australia. I said I was in Egypt. Egypt, they have Cairo divided into sections. And in certain sections of Cairo, you can have Christian churches. But only in those sections. And you're not supposed to witness or talk about the Lord outside those sections of town. And so I'm there. I'd preached in Syria 18 years ago. Many Syria, a couple million people from Syria are in Cairo now, in Egypt. because of all the horrors going on there. And many of the people I preached to in the church in Latakia, Syria, are now in Cairo, and they have a church there in Cairo. And so I was over to preach to that church. And so we had a session on Baptist heritage, and it was open, and there was another Syrian church that was there, and then an Egyptian church. That church actually translated my book, Faithful Baptist Witness, into Arabic, and have distributed thousands of copies of it in the Mideast. And then they were sponsoring it. And we had some, y'all won't get mad at me if I tell you who, will you? Had some Southern Baptist Convention missionaries come in to this meeting. And in a question and answer session, they took exception to some things I said. Because they said we should not be witnessing to Muslim people because it's against the law here in Egypt to talk about Christianity to Muslims. And so as good Christians that obey the law, we should not witness to Muslim people. And we had a bit of it's open question and answer session. We had a bit of a discussion over that for a few moments. And they got so wound up, the pastor of the church physically had them removed. And in the course of that came up the question, while in theory you can have a Baptist church in Egypt in certain sections, you're not in any section supposed to baptize anybody by immersion. And so those missionaries took that same position too, that it was not the will of God for anybody to be baptized by immersion in Egypt. I mean, you understand the kind of things we face in a world gone crazy? We have been shielded throughout our nation's history by the First Amendment, which limited Congress from passing a law regulating religion, and the 14th Amendment, which said the states can't either. We've been so shielded, we have no idea how good we've had it. But nobody should just take that for granted or assume that no matter what, it stays that way. And I was in St. Cloud, Minnesota, 45 minutes away 2 weeks ago when those folks went into and disrupted that church service, blocked people from getting to the nursery and getting their children, backed an elderly lady up against the wall, yelling at her about her white privilege, created a stir, not allowing the pastor to preach a message. And that wasn't Syria. That wasn't Egypt. That was the United States. And right now, and of course, our federal government, and properly, there's a specific government act that forbids you to do that kind of thing. And several of the people that did that have now been arrested and facing prosecution. One, Don Lemon, is fairly famous. Used to be a commentator on CNN. But the people are rallying around the country to defend them on that argument. It's a church. Anybody can say anything they want to in a church. Forgive me for going on this a bit, but some years back when I'm pastoring in Chicago, we had a young man. He'd been out of church for years. He was technically a member of our church. He way away from the Lord, and he was in a Chicago street gang, and he got caught in bed with the girlfriend of the leader of a different Chicago street gang, and they killed him. They pulled him out in the street and beat him to death. So, funerals at the church I'm pastoring. And we got word. The church had 3 sections, of pews. That the gang he's a member of was coming to the funeral. And the gang that killed him was coming to the funeral. And they were going to have a fight. So I said, Pastor, what are you going to do? I said, relax, I'll handle it. And sure enough, we get to the funeral service, and my church members are sitting in the middle. And I got one gang sitting over here. And I got one gang sitting over here. So I just look at them and said, look, we have a number of visitors here today. And it might be that some of you are not familiar with how we do things in a Baptist church. And I understand if you haven't been here and you don't know, but let me just explain this to you. I'm the pastor. I decide what happens here. I decide who speaks here. Nobody here is doing anything today without my permission. And if I haven't called on you to do something, you're not doing it. They all behave themselves. They got in a big fight later at the cemetery. But they behaved themselves in church. Somebody came up after and said, Pastor, what were you going to do if they didn't listen to you? I said, I didn't have the faintest idea. I was just hoping that they couldn't figure that out. But I would have had the law behind me. You understand? But right now, in the United States, there's a desperate movement to try and change that. So, I mean, this is an issue. So it's an issue in Australia. I've been to Australia twice. It's an issue for the missionaries in Australia. And it's issue is real. And it's an issue in England. I've been to England once. It's an issue right now, right here in the United States. And we're quickly developing two Americas. You figure out why people are building houses everywhere in Florida and Texas and Tennessee, and folks coming from all over the country because they want to live in free states. And so that's the challenge that's in front of us. 2 churches in Minnesota I preach in every year. And wonderful people and great churches. And that's the challenge that's in front of them. One of them's in St. Cloud and one of them is in Bemidji. And wonderful people, but they are surrounded by this mentality. Well, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 through 3. Wherefore, you know, the word wherefore always goes right back to what came right before. Right before Hebrews chapter 12 is Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 is the hall of faith. And it lists folks who lived for the Lord in unusual times, in challenging times, and accomplished great things. And some of them were great prophets, and some of them were kings. One of them, Rahab, was a harlot that trusted Christ in Jericho. And then at the end, it begins to, well, let's just look there. Hebrews chapter 11. He's gone through some of these very famous folks. And then said, verse 32, what shall I more say, for the time shall fail me to tell of Gideon, of Barak, of Samson, of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. But that sounds pretty exciting, doesn't it? Quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead, raised to life again. That's all pretty exciting, isn't it? You want to read the rest of it? And others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, moreover bonds and imprisonment. And you understand? God does allow at times his people to suffer for him. I mean, the Lord often gives folks incredible victories and incredible protection. But sometimes he allows us to glorify him through going through the sufferings and the persecution. I just got asked today to write a foreword to a book written by a friend of mine. You probably may know him, Pastor Tony Searcy, down in Plant City. And just written a book on Baptist heritage in the United States and how our forefathers won freedom for us here in the United States, going through real times of persecution and heartache and difficulty right in the American colonies. He asked if I'd write the foreword for it, which I promised to do. I told him I'd try and get it done tomorrow afternoon. But I mean, we have a glorious heritage, but we have a story of people who paid the price. Hebrews 11, which goes through telling about Moses and Jacob and all this wonderful stuff. But you get the rest of it. Others had trials of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn asunder. Were tempted. Were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains, in dens and caves of the earth. Now y'all watch this. Some of them were rescued by the Lord, some weren't. Not because some of them were good guys and some of them were bad guys. Of whom the world was not worthy, verse 30, and these all, okay, all the ones that God intervened for, and all the ones he allowed to glorify him through persecution, these all, having obtained a good report through faith, receive not the promise. God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. Wherefore, okay, next chapter, the passage we're on, passage I've been planning to preach on tonight for a couple weeks, takes us right back to Hebrews chapter 11 and the hall of faith, including those who suffered, being faithful to the Lord. Wherefore? So, you know this, you understand this. So this is the lesson we're going to draw from those folks. Wherefore, seeing we're also compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Good Bible teachers have debated over who the witnesses are here. Some say the witnesses go back to chapter 11, the folks who were just listed. Others say, well, no, the word also said those folks had a great cloud of witnesses, but we have a great cloud of witnesses just like they do. Either way, you get the idea. We're being watched. What we do makes a difference. What we do has an impact. What we do gets noticed. Our testimony matters. First pastorate, a little town with 200 homes in it. Had an Independent Baptist church here in town. Church had been through 7 pastors in 21 years. It was known as a preacher killer church. Some churches have that reputation. Some deserve it. And you'd think an intelligent person would not have been the 8th pastor. And an intelligent person wasn't. But I was. And so I go there, and I have 200 homes. This is my job number 1. I'm going to knock on every door. I'm going to introduce myself as a new pastor. I'm going to invite them to church. I'm going to talk to them about the Lord, see what I can do. But the previous pastor to me, they'd had a situation where he and that congregation got in a debate during a business meeting, and he dropped on the platform with a heart attack during the debate. And so somebody called 911. And a volunteer fire department, with folks lived in town, come in, and they're trying to work on him. While they're trying to work on him, the folks are still gathered around yelling at him and screaming at him and calling him names while they're trying to work on him having had a heart attack. Everybody in town knew that story. First home, I'd gotten 200 cards. I was going to try and write down the names of the people at every house and whether I got in or not and stay on it till I could give it. First house I got in, they wanted to tell me the story about that. They weren't there, but they knew about that business meeting. Second family I got in with, they want to tell me the story about that business meeting. I kept at it till I at least met at the door people from all 200 homes. You want to know how many homes mentioned that to me? Every single one. Now, we had the church grow for a while. The community got incorporated in Indianapolis. They elected me to be the community representative, community council president, represent the community to Indianapolis. Quite an honor. Not one of those families ever came to our church. All of our growth came from getting people farther away. Nobody in that town would touch that church even after they honored the pastor by electing me to that position. See, we have a cloud of witnesses. What we do is being watched. What we do is being noticed. What we do matters. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed with so great a cloud of witnesses, here's what we ought to do. Number one, let us lay aside every weight. Everything that would keep us from effectively serving the Lord, let's get rid of it. When it mentions a weight, that doesn't necessarily mean it's evil. Folks can get too involved in sports. Folks can get too involved in politics to serve the Lord. Folks can get involved all kinds that aren't necessarily sins, but they become weights. You got to wait. Anything that's keeping you from being faithful to serve the Lord, set it aside. Every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us. Y'all ready? People know our sin. So, pastor doesn't know where I go. He doesn't know what I do. I'm assuming I'm not running into him there, you know. But see, once people have spotted you as a Christian, they pay attention. In my first experience in ministry, I was youth pastor in a church where we had teenagers from 7 different high schools. And whenever I would go out to visit one of our teens that visited with us, and they were from such and such high school, oh yeah, I know so-and-so and so-and-so from your school. And you want to know what happened next? They'd tell me all their faults. Instantly that registered. They go to your church. Did you know they had a cloud of witnesses? And I'd deal with things. I didn't call anybody out by name, but I'd be preaching about sin and things, and I'd give some pretty significant, practical illustrations of sin, and just sort of look the direction of the person that had to do with. You understand, knowing the witnesses we have? Lay aside the sin. And then to get the image, he uses an athletic illustration. Let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Well, that makes sense, wouldn't it, if he's going to run a race? You add some extra weight. Maybe you don't want to run a race wearing your heaviest, thickest shoes. Maybe you don't want to run a race with having smoked and filled up your lungs with tars and nicotines. So run with patience. Learn something from the fellow that runs a race. He gets ready for the race that he runs and stays ready as long as he's running it, and we should learn something from that. What do we do? Looking into Jesus, who we look to. Okay? You won't look to the church. We don't look to the pastor. You have a wonderful pastor. Cindy and I appreciate him so much. We get lots of information from the church here and all that, and so we're able to keep in touch with a fair amount of things and all that. And boy, I thank God for his fellowship and for his friendship. But you will not have the same pastor forever. Pastors come, they go, eventually they all die. I can't tell you how many great churches I've seen fall apart when a pastor dies. And that wasn't what he worked for, and that wasn't what he aimed for. But folks were looking to him, and when he wasn't there to look to anymore, looking to Jesus. So we look into the church. What if you move? What if you have circumstances that require you to move? I can't tell how many people I've seen fall out of serving the Lord because they changed geographic location and they couldn't find a church that was identical to their last church or a pastor that was exactly like their last pastor. Looking unto Jesus. You want to know who never changes? No one has ever quit serving the Lord because of Jesus. The author and finisher of our faith. He's the whole thing. And man, you get this? People, they're trusting. You ask somebody, well, are you going to heaven when you die? And they say, yes. How do you know? And they'll say, well, I was baptized. Didn't say look to baptism. I go to such a church over here. Didn't say look to the church. Said, I repented of all my sins. No, you didn't. Let me ask your family that knows you best if you repented of all of them. So, but because I gave money. Because there's some sins I've never committed. There's some sins I stopped committing. Some sins I never got the chance to commit. I've never wasted $1 million, for example, in my entire life. Or there's some good things I've done. Looking unto Jesus. If anybody else is part of the subject when you're talking about salvation, you've missed it. Jesus is the author and finisher of our faith. I probably told this story here before, but forgive me for repeating it. I had an amazing experience in Chicago while I pastored Ravenswood Baptist Church. We had a great fellowship with a group of Ethiopian people and started an Ethiopian church in Chicago. And I was actually the pastor of the Ethiopian church for several years. Oh, it looked like an African pastor. I got a kick out of it. Today it's an independent church, and they have me in to preach once a year, and everybody calls me pastor, and I always get the biggest kick out of being there. They had in Chicago a monthly African pastors fellowship, and I would go just because I got a kick out of being an African pastor. And every month they'd take a picture of the pastors that were present in a group picture. For some reason, they always had me stand in the middle. Great folks. Today they're an independent church with a great building and a great program and doing incredibly well. I remember our first service, we had 20 people. I was just there the second Sunday of January. The teen choir had 52 teenagers in it. I had a guess there was 400 people there. And we were going along great, and God was blessing it. And one of the Ethiopian ladies called me, and she said her son, little Boaz, who's 5, but said he's talking a lot about salvation. He wants to talk to you, Pastor. Is it okay? I said, well, sure. He comes to my office, sits right across the desk from me, speaks right up. I said, boys, I understand you're concerned about salvation. That's right, Pastor. I said, can you tell me what salvation means? He said, it means Jesus died for my sins. I forget the rest of the stuff. That's a really good answer if you're talking about salvation. You can forget all the other stuff. The issue is that Jesus died for my sins. Amen. Now, little Boaz, He's taller than me, and that's before the afro. He's really taller than me if you count that. He's in charge of their teen church. Their teen church is in English, and they're bringing in all kinds of people, Chinese kids and Korean kids and all kinds of stuff. He preaches every Sunday. And so I asked him a couple years back, I said, Boaz, what are you preaching about? He looked at me and smiled. He said that Jesus died for my sins. He's the author and finisher of our faith. Martin Luther said, the greatest truth in the history of the universe is this, that salvation is found in a person. Found in Jesus Christ. How do I know I'm going to heaven when I die? I'm not going to tell you I was a pastor or a preacher. There were some sins I never committed. There were some good things I did. I'm not going to tell you that I was a Baptist or that I was a church member or that I got baptized. I'm going to tell you I accepted the pardon that Jesus Christ paid for me on the cross of Calvary. He's the author and finisher of my faith, who for the joy that was set before him, it goes on, endured the cross, the horrors of the cross. The Romans designed crucifixion as a way of terrifying people into obedience to the Roman Empire, so that they planned out the most painful, agonizing, possible public means of death that they could devise. He endured the cross, despising the shame. You say, what shame? He had our sin put upon him. He wept over the idea before he got there. He cried out on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? But he endured the cross. He despised the shame and is now set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Why did he do that? For the joy that was set before him. You say, what joy? The cross wasn't any joy. The shame wasn't any joy. The joy of seeing you saved. And creating a set of circumstances without transgressing his holy nature, that you can have fellowship with him forever and ever and ever. The Lord found joy in that. Meditate on that a little bit, that the God of heaven has joy in fellowshipping with me. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. Y'all ready? You want to keep on serving the Lord? You keep looking to Jesus. I went during a difficult time. I went to the pastor that had led my father to Christ and was influential in my life as a child. I got saved into his ministry, and I'm talking to him about various things, and he said, look, he said, you just have to settle one thing. I asked him specifically, because I knew he'd been through some horrible circumstances. How is it you've kept on serving the Lord so long? He said, you just have to settle one thing. Who are you serving? If you're serving him, you keep on serving, because he's never let you down. This group of people, that person, that situation, that circumstance, but he's never let you down. Years ago, and when I say years ago, I was in my 20s, half century ago. I ran into a young lady that I had known when we were both teenagers. And we were around each other in youth activities and the things of the Lord. And as a teenager, she was serving the Lord. A few years later, she was living a lifestyle that was adamantly, totally, completely against Christian values. I didn't know it, wasn't aware of it, hadn't heard about it, but I ran into her, and I'm talking to her a little bit, and I'm saying, what happened to you? I remember when you lived for the Lord and you want to do what's right. I said, what happened? She said, what's Jesus done for me lately? And I was a young preacher then. And to be honest, I'm not all that tactful now. But I wasn't tactful at all then. And I said, you been in hell lately? You want to know why you haven't been in hell lately? Because Christ died for you on the cross. And he gave you eternal life. And the eternal life you got the moment you were saved is the eternal life you still have now. And that's what he's done for you lately. It says, consider him. Looking into Jesus, consider him. Had a preacher friend, and he had a ministry trying to help preachers that were discouraged and difficulty. Sometimes they were in difficulty of their own fault, sometimes other people's situation, but just had a ministry to help encourage preachers. He helped encourage me when I went through hard times in my first pastorate. It turned out to be the same nightmare for me it had been for the preachers before me. What a shock. But on occasion, he would take me with him to talk to a preacher that was going through difficulty. And I heard him say this several times to people in different settings. You can quit when Jesus quits. When Jesus quits taking care of you, then you can quit serving him. You see, you want to know what happened after the cross? He went to the right hand of the throne of God, where he ever liveth to make intercession for us. He hasn't quit on me. Consequently, I don't have any right to quit on him. You say, but there are challenges. Well, it's for sure. You say, well, physically it's harder to serve the Lord than it used to be. Trust me, I've learned a little bit about that. It's been since I've got to know you folks here, but 5 years ago, in an accident caused by a semi-truck that plowed into 5 cars, I was the middle car. People in the 2 cars behind me were killed. I, by the grace of God, got out with relatively minor injuries at the time. Car was totaled. But I got jarred. And I was having a little bit of arthritis trouble in my joints before that. Man, I could tell you all about how that works since then. I'd be going nonstop, have been my whole life, my whole ministry. I promised the Lord that when I was 18, if he'd keep me busy preaching, because I see preachers who weren't busy preaching and they were miserable. So if he'd keep me busy preaching, I would never care about the size of the crowd I preached to. I would never care about the finances connected with it. I've never asked a preacher anywhere for finances or brought the subject up when I was going to preach for them. And then later I added on to that and said, if you'll keep me busy, I'll never care about the color of the skin of the people I'm preaching to. Didn't know then I was going to be an African pastor, but man, I've been in all kinds of situations. I've slept on jungle floors. Do you know I don't do that anymore? I've flown all night to get to a place to preach in the morning and gone without sleep. Don't do that anymore either. I just ran nonstop. When I begin to go through some of the physical challenges that I have as a result of that accident, people would begin to ask me when I was going to slow down, when I was going to quit, when I was going to do that. No, so I just redesigned everything. I stay in Holiday Inns now instead of sleeping on the jungle floor. I have found the beds at the Holiday Inn do not irritate my arthritis like a jungle floor does. I'm careful with my circumstances. I change some things. But I preach and teach now at 72 more than this coming year. If the schedule holds up like it's planned, I will preach and teach more this year than at any time in my life. I'm on my way to the Philippines to teach in 3 Bible colleges. One of which I helped start, one of which our church started. And I now have the privilege of being vice president of that college, just like I'm vice president of that college here in the States. I don't plan on quitting. I have adjusted. I may very well have to adjust again. The lady that was knocking on doors and got me to come to church, ride a bus for the first time, trying to build a bus route all those years ago, 62 years ago. Years later, lost touch with her, but years later I was asked to preach at a Bible study at Pendleton Reformatory, and I got there and all the men were talking about Mom. And Mom was a lady that always came and brought refreshments. And she would take prayer requests for their families. And she'd try to contact and visit with their families and all that. You know who Mom turned out to be? Same lady that knocked on my door when I was 10 years old. She's still serving the Lord. She'd changed some in the method of it. Years later, when my mother had critically had Alzheimer's and couldn't be taken care of at home, there was no choice but to put her into a nursing facility. I purposely picked the nursing facility that this lady that had reached me for Christ was in, so that when I could go visit both of them in one visit. She didn't know we were coming. I was there getting Mom set up in a room, and this little old lady wheels in a wheelchair. It was her. And she'd got her church to sponsor her. And whenever a new patient came to the nursing home, she'd give them this basket with some sundries and toiletries and some things to eat, and a Bible and gospel tracts. She was still at the very end going out to reach people. Looking unto Jesus. I can quit when Jesus quits. Looking unto Jesus for my salvation. Looking unto Jesus for my motivation to keep serving. And God forbid, but if it be His choice to let us come to days of persecution here, and we're so spoiled, we don't even know what it would be like. But if God would choose to take us to that moment, we have a great cloud of witnesses that went before us. You know, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego told Nebuchadnezzar that whether God delivered them from the fire or not, they would not bow. They knew 2 things. God might deliver them because He could, and they knew He might not because He doesn't always. And they were going to be faithful either way. Wherefore, we should be looking into Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Give Him everything that we can in our service for Him. Pastor.